The paper was thin as a whisper, and the pencil had been sharpened so many times that it was barely longer than her thumb, but she pressed the lead against the scrap and began to write in letters so small that only someone who knew to look would ever find them. And she wrote because writing was the only weapon she had left, and because the world needed to know what was happening behind these walls, and because if she died here, at least her words might survive to tell the truth. Her name was Geneva Marie Washington, and she had been born in 1919 in Baltimore, where her father worked on the docks and her mother cleaned houses for white families who never learned her name. And Geneva had grown up watching her parents disappear into jobs that consumed their bodies while she sat in segregated schools and dreamed of becoming a writer who would tell stories that mattered, and stories that changed things, and stories that made people see what they had chosen to ignore. She had been working as a secretary at a black newspaper when the war began, and she had written articles about the men from her neighborhood who were shipping out to fight, and she had interviewed their mothers and their wives and their children, and she had documented the quiet heroism of people who were sending their sons to defend a country that did not defend them, and her editor had seen something in her words and had recommended her for a position with the War Department. But what happened next changed everything, because in 1944, Geneva was assigned to a unit that was supposed to document conditions in recently liberated areas. And she traveled to Europe with a typewriter and a camera and a notebook filled with questions, and she thought she understood what war looked like from the photographs she had seen and the stories she had written, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality of what she would witness. The unit landed in France after D-Day, and Geneva followed the advancing troops through villages that had been reduced to rubble and past bodies that lay in ditches, with her eyes open to the sky, and she wrote about everything she saw because that was her job, and because the words kept the horror at a distance, and because she believed that bearing witness was a form of resistance against the forces that wanted to erase what had happened here. Yet she never imagined this moment would reshape her destiny, because during the Battle of the Bulge, her unit was cut off from the main American forces. When German troops launched their massive counteroffensive, and Geneva found herself running through a forest at night with shells exploding around her. And when dawn came, she was alone and lost, and the Germans found her before she could find her way back to safety. They did not know what to make of her because she was black and she was a woman, and she carried identification that said she worked for the American War Department, and the officer who interrogated her spoke English with a Bavarian accent, and he asked her question after question about troop movements and command structures, and she told him nothing because she knew nothing that would help them, and because silence was the only power she had. And then something no one expected. Because instead of executing her or sending her to a labor camp, the Germans decided that she might have propaganda value, and they transferred her to a prisoner of war facility where American and British service members were being held, and they announced over the camp loudspeakers that America had sent a Negro woman to fight their war, which proved how desperate the Allies had become, and Geneva listened to their words and felt a cold fury building in her chest. The prison camp was a place called Stalag Savannah, near the town of Moosburg in Bavaria, and it held thousands of prisoners from every Allied nation crowded into barracks that had been built for half as many, and the cold seeped through the walls. And the food was never enough, and disease spread through the population like whispered rumors. And Geneva watched and listened, and began to record everything she observed in secret. Notes that she hid in the seams of her clothing. Behind these ruins a secret waited, because Geneva discovered that she had a gift for becoming invisible, and the guards, who watched the male prisoners, constantly paid little attention to the black woman who swept floors and carried water and moved through the camp like a shadow, and she used that invisibility to gather information that no one else could have obtained, and she wrote it all down in a handwriting so small it looked like dust on the paper. She documented the names of prisoners who died and the causes of their deaths, and she recorded the rations they received and the punishments that were handed out, and she noted which guards were cruel and which showed moments of unexpected kindness, and she wrote about the hierarchy that developed among the prisoners and the ways they found to maintain their humanity in conditions designed to strip it away. What she discovered next would shake even her commanders, because Geneva learned that some of the prisoners were not who they claimed to be, and that there were men in the camp who wore American uniforms but who whispered to the guards and who received extra food, and who disappeared for hours at a time. And she realized that the Germans had planted informers among the prisoners to identify escape attempts and resistance activities. She began to track these men, and she documented their movements, and she passed warnings to other prisoners through a network of whispers and glances. and she became the center of an intelligence operation that existed entirely in her head, and in the tiny notes she kept hidden in places. The guards would never think to search, and she saved lives that she would never be credited with saving because the men she warned did not know who had warned them. The other prisoners looked at her with curiosity at first, because most of them had never interacted with a black woman as an equal, and some of them carried the prejudices of the America they had left behind, but Geneva did not have time for their discomfort, and she treated everyone the same, and gradually they began to see her not as a black woman, but simply as a fellow prisoner who was suffering alongside them. There was a lieutenant from Ohio named William Foster who had been shot down over Germany and who had broken both legs when he parachuted into a forest and who could barely walk, even after months of healing, and Geneva helped him move around the camp and brought him extra scraps of food when she could find them. And they talked through the long, cold nights about their lives before the war and their hopes for what would come after. William told her about his wife and his 2 daughters and the hardware store he planned to open when he got home, and Geneva told him about Baltimore and the newspaper and the stories she wanted to write, and they became friends in the way that only people who are suffering together can become friends, and that friendship would last for the rest of their lives and change both of them in ways they could not have predicted. The winter of 1945 was brutal, and prisoners died every week from cold and malnutrition and disease, and Geneva documented each death with the same careful attention she had given to everything else, and she wrote about the burials in the frozen ground and the prayers that were said over bodies wrapped in blankets, and the faces of men who realized that they might be next, and her notes became a chronicle of survival and loss. She hid the papers in dozens of locations around the camp because keeping them all in one place was too dangerous, and she memorized where each cache was hidden, and she developed a system of codes and abbreviations that would mean nothing to anyone who did not have the key. And the key existed only in her memory, and she guarded that memory like it was the most precious thing she owned because it was. The guards caught her once with a paper in her hand, and she swallowed it before they could read what was written, and the taste of pencil lead and her own saliva was the taste of survival, and they beat her, but she did not tell them what she had been doing, and they decided that she had been writing a letter to her family, and they took away her pencil, but she found another one 2 days later dropped by a careless guard. And then something no one expected, because in April 1945, the prisoners began to hear rumors that the Americans were close, and the guards grew nervous, and some of them disappeared in the night, and the commandant made announcements that everything was under control, but no one believed him. And Geneva wrote faster because she knew that liberation was coming, and she wanted to have a complete record ready when it arrived. The tanks came on April 29th, and they were American tanks with white stars on their sides, and the prisoners who could walk rushed to the gates and cheered and wept, and Geneva stood in the center of the camp and watched, and felt nothing at all because she had used up every emotion during those months of captivity, and there was nothing left inside her but a hollow exhaustion and a determination to finish what she had started. The liberating forces included a young journalist from Chicago who was looking for stories to send back home, and Geneva approached him and told him that she had something he needed to see, and she began pulling scraps of paper from the seams of her clothing, and from the soles of her shoes, and from the lining of her coat, and the journalist watched in amazement as she assembled a stack of notes that documented everything that had happened in the camp. Her documentation became evidence in war crimes trials that would follow, and her observations helped identify guards who had committed atrocities, and her careful records of deaths and causes gave families closure that they would never have had otherwise. And the military intelligence officers who reviewed her notes said they were the most comprehensive, first-hand account of POW conditions they had ever seen from a single source. But the recognition she deserved did not come immediately, because Geneva was a black woman, and the stories that the newspapers wanted to tell were stories about white heroes, and her name was mentioned in classified reports but not in public ceremonies, and she returned to Baltimore without medals or fanfare. And she went back to work at the newspaper, and she wrote about the veterans who were coming home and the challenges they faced. She never forgot the men she had left behind in the frozen ground of Bavaria, and every year on the anniversary of the liberation, she wrote their names in a journal, and she said them aloud like a prayer. And William Foster came to visit her once a year, and they would sit together and remember the camp and the cold, and the fear and the friendship that had kept them both alive. The civil rights movement gave her a new purpose, and she covered the marches and the sit-ins and the speeches for the newspaper, and she saw the same courage in the young people demanding equality that she had seen in the prisoners, resisting despair, and she wrote about them with the same careful attention to detail that had characterized her secret notes and her articles helped shape the way Black Baltimore understood its role in the struggle. Her notes from the prison camp were eventually donated to the National Archives, where historians discover them decades later and recognize their significance, and a young researcher wrote a book about the Black Americans who had been held as prisoners of war during World War II, and Geneva's story became a chapter in that book, and her name began to appear in footnotes and bibliographies, and finally in the main text of history. The recognition came in 2001, when Geneva was 80 years old, and the Army awarded her a medal for her contributions to military intelligence, and a general pinned it on her chest in a ceremony at Fort Meade, and she accepted it with the same quiet dignity she had shown throughout her life, and she told the audience that she had only done what anyone would have done, and that the real heroes were the ones who had not survived. But we know that is not true, because not everyone would have done what Geneva Washington did, and not everyone would have risked their life to document the truth. Not everyone would have swallowed paper to protect their secrets. Not everyone would have fought for equality for another 50 years after the war ended, and her humility was just another form of her courage. William Foster attended the ceremony, and he was in a wheelchair now because his legs had never fully healed, but his eyes were bright, and when Geneva saw him, she smiled for the first time that day, and they held hands. While the photographs were taken, and the image of the two old veterans who had survived together became one of the most powerful photographs of that year. Geneva Marie Washington passed away in 2008 at the age of 89, and her funeral in Baltimore was attended by historians and veterans and journalists and ordinary people who had read her story and wanted to pay their respects, and the minister who spoke at her service said that she had shown the world that bearing witness is a form of resistance, and that truth is a weapon that cannot be defeated. The notes she wrote in that prison camp are preserved now in acid-free folders in climate control rooms, and researchers who study them wear white gloves and speak in whispers as if they are handling sacred texts. And in a sense they are, because those notes represent the triumph of human determination over circumstances that were designed to destroy it. And every tiny letter is a monument to courage. Her story reminds us that history is written not only by generals and presidents, but by ordinary people who refuse to let the truth be erased. And Geneva Washington was a secretary from Baltimore who became a prisoner of war, who became a witness to history, and her notes survived when so much else was lost, and they speak across the decades with a clarity that time cannot diminish. The camp where she was held is a memorial now, and visitors walk through reconstructed barracks and red plaques that describe what happened there. And among the stories told is the story of a black woman who documented everything she saw, and her name is carved in stone, alongside the names of those who died, and she would have been embarrassed by the recognition, but she would have been proud that the truth survived. And so we remember Geneva Marie Washington not as a victim of war or racism, but as a victor over everything that tried to silence her, and we remember her not because she sought glory, but because she sought only truth, and in seeking truth, she proved that words are weapons and witnesses are warriors, and that one woman with a pencil can change the world. The paper was thin as a whisper, and the pencil was barely longer than her thumb, but the words she wrote with them outlived the empire that imprisoned her, and outlived the war that tried to destroy her. And they speak still to anyone who takes the time to read them, and they will speak forever, because truth does not die and courage does not fade, and Geneva Marie Washington does not end. She simply continues in a different form.